Daniel Brooks had always been the kind of man who found peace in silence. He was 38, a father of 2, and known throughout his small Idaho town for his calm demeanor and love for the outdoors. Every November, he would disappear into the dense wilderness of Black Pine Forest for his annual hunting trip, a tradition that went back to his teenage years. People admired his dedication and experience. After all, Daniel knew the forest better than most. He could track elk for miles, identify animal sounds in the dark, and survive in freezing temperatures with only basic supplies. So when he didn't return home on schedule in 2012, no one was immediately alarmed. His wife, Melissa, wasn't too worried the first day he missed. Daniel often stayed longer if he thought he was close to tagging something big. But as hours turned into a full day, concern began to creep in. His cell phone had no signal in the woods, so she waited, nervously, until the next morning. When there was still no sign of Daniel, she called the sheriff's office. A search team was organized quickly, involving local volunteers, dogs, and even helicopters. What followed was 2 weeks of desperate searching. The forest was vast, overgrown in places, with steep ravines and thick underbrush that made it nearly impossible to comb every area thoroughly. They found footprints at a remote campsite and a half-burnt fire pit. A few shell casings, a trail of animal blood, and crushed brush suggested that Daniel had been hunting successfully. But then, nothing. The trail just stopped. No body, no truck, no signs of distress. Searchers said it was like he had walked into thin air. The community, at first hopeful, soon began to whisper. Theories formed, each more bizarre than the last. Some thought Daniel had fallen into a ravine or drowned in a hidden stream. Others believed a bear or cougar had attacked him, though no remains or blood trail supported that idea. A few more skeptical townsfolk suspected foul play. After all, it wasn't uncommon for hunters to clash over territory or game. But Daniel had no known enemies, no debts, no suspicious behavior before he left. He had simply kissed his wife goodbye, packed his gear, and driven off in his green 2006 Dodge pickup, never to be seen again. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. Melissa tried to move forward for the sake of their children, but the weight of not knowing what happened gnawed at her every day. She kept Daniel's hunting gear in the garage untouched, hoping, praying, that one day he might walk back through the door. But each passing year without news chipped away at that hope. By 2015, most people in town had accepted the idea that Daniel Brooks was gone for good. The sheriff's department closed the case as unsolved but inactive, and Daniel was eventually declared legally dead. His family held a small memorial. Still, no one could explain how a man, his truck, and every trace of his life could vanish without a single clue. Black Pine Forest developed a new reputation after that. Hikers reported eerie feelings, unexplained sounds, and an unsettling quiet that seemed to cling to certain parts of the woods. Hunters avoided the area where Daniel was last known to be. Some claimed the forest didn't just hide things, it swallowed them. People talked about him like a ghost story, a reminder of how even the most skilled outdoorsman could disappear in a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. Melissa never gave up entirely. She kept every newspaper article, police report, and search map tucked in a binder. On anniversaries, she would drive the outer trail of the forest and leave a lantern at the closest spot where the search teams once stood. Her children grew up with only fragmented memories of their father, camping trips, bedtime stories, his scent of pine and leather. All they had left were photographs and questions. Still, some things didn't add up. The police couldn't figure out how his truck could vanish without a trace. No gas station cameras, no roadside sightings. It was as if the vehicle had simply ceased to exist. Daniel's banking accounts were never touched, and his phone never pinged a tower again after the day he entered the forest. He hadn't planned to vanish. He told co-workers about his trip, and even left a list of chores to do when he returned. There were no signs he had run away. There was no suicide note, no erratic behavior, no financial troubles. By all accounts, Daniel was a man with every reason to come back, and none to leave. The official theory leaned toward a tragic accident. Maybe he'd slipped and fallen somewhere deep in the woods, and nature had hidden his body too well. Maybe his truck had been buried under a landslide, or submerged in one of the forest's many hidden creeks. But those who knew Daniel personally refused to accept such a tidy conclusion. Not because they couldn't handle the truth, but because the truth didn't seem to be there at all. It wasn't just a case of a missing man. It was a silence too loud to ignore, an absence that seemed deliberate. Something about Daniel's disappearance didn't feel random. It felt like someone had made sure he wouldn't be found, and for nearly 7 years, they were right. In May 2019, nature revealed what it had hidden for so long. A massive wildfire tore through parts of Black Pine Forest after an unusually dry spring. It burned thousands of acres, swallowing trees, wildlife, and anything in its path. As emergency crews worked around the clock to contain the flames, a group of firefighters stumbled upon something odd on the third day, a patch of untouched brush behind a large fallen pine. Beneath it was the rusted roof of a vehicle, barely visible under layers of dirt, moss, and branches. When the fire crew cleared the area and realized what they were looking at, they called the authorities. Deputies arrived, and what they uncovered was a truck so corroded that its original color was barely visible. The front end had been crushed slightly, the windows were clouded with grime, and the license plate was barely hanging on. But the numbers were still readable. A quick check with DMV records confirmed it was the same 2006 green Dodge pickup truck that Daniel Brooks had driven the day he disappeared. Excitement and dread swept through the department. After nearly 7 years of silence, there was finally something concrete. But what they found inside raised more questions than it answered. Slumped over the steering wheel was a human skeleton, clothes in tatters, boots nearly turned to dust. The body had decayed far beyond recognition, but investigators knew it wasn't Daniel the moment they checked the dental records. The man in the truck was Lucas Harlan, a known drifter with a long rap sheet of petty crimes. He had been arrested several times for theft, trespassing, and minor drug offenses in several western states. His last known appearance in any official record was in 2014, when he was briefly detained in Utah. After that, he'd vanished. The truck hadn't moved. There were no signs it had ever been driven out of the forest. It had just been hidden, covered by time, nature, and misfortune. Investigators were stunned. How did Lucas end up inside Daniel Brooks's missing vehicle? The two men had no known connection. Their backgrounds were completely different. Daniel was a family man, a hunter with deep roots in Idaho. Lucas was a wanderer, mostly homeless, moving from place to place, surviving on odd jobs and stolen goods. As forensics teams carefully documented the scene, they noticed something strange. The ignition was off, but the keys were still in the truck. The gas tank was empty. There were empty food wrappers and a water bottle, along with an old backpack in the passenger seat. There were no signs of trauma on the bones, no weapons, and no bullet holes in the vehicle. Whatever killed Lucas, it hadn't been violence, at least not directly. It looked like he had sat down in the truck, leaned forward, and never moved again. An autopsy would later suggest starvation and dehydration as the probable cause of death. But that only deepened the mystery. Why didn't he leave? Why die in a truck so close to hiking trails and creeks? Why hadn't he tried to get help? Investigators began to dig into Lucas's past, hoping to find a connection to Daniel. They interviewed people who had known Lucas during his last years: shelter volunteers, probation officers, former roommates. Most described him as erratic, quiet, and sometimes paranoid. He never stayed anywhere long, but one interview stood out. A trail maintenance worker named Brett remembered Lucas from a 2013 summer program just a few miles from where the truck was found. He said Lucas had a strange fascination with the forest, often going off trail and talking about living free in the wild. Brett recalled one comment in particular. Lucas had once bragged about finding abandoned stuff in the woods that could get a man through winter. Authorities began to piece together a new theory. Lucas may have come across the truck years after Daniel vanished. Perhaps he found it accidentally while exploring off-trail. He could have used the supplies left inside, maybe even slept in the vehicle. But then the question grew darker. What if Lucas hadn't just found the truck? What if he'd found Daniel? The possibilities were disturbing. Had Daniel been injured and Lucas found him too late? Or had Lucas encountered him alive and done something terrible? If Lucas had taken the truck, that meant he knew what it was and who it belonged to. If Daniel had died naturally, Lucas could have reported it. But he hadn't. Instead, he'd hidden in the forest, lived in a stolen vehicle, and died there, alone. The truck had become a tomb for two mysteries: one man's death and another's disappearance. And while one story had reached its end, the other remained frustratingly incomplete. For Daniel's family, the discovery was a shock. After so many years of silence, there was finally movement, but no resolution. The truck had come back, but Daniel hadn't. It was as if time had preserved part of the truth, just enough to disturb the silence, but not enough to speak it fully. Investigators knew the forest didn't give up its secrets easily, and this case had just gotten more complicated. With the discovery of the truck and Lucas Harlan's body, investigators were forced to revisit a case that had long been considered cold. The timeline of events suddenly became tangled and complicated. Daniel Brooks had disappeared in late 2012. Lucas Harlan had last been seen alive in 2014, 2 years later. How the two stories connected was unclear, but the overlap raised crucial questions. Did their paths cross? And if so, what happened between them? Authorities launched an extensive review of Lucas's history, hoping to uncover clues that might explain why he had ended up in Daniel's truck, miles from civilization, in the middle of a vast forest. Lucas's criminal record revealed a troubled life. From a young age, he had drifted through foster homes and juvenile detention centers, never able to hold down a steady job or maintain a stable residence. By his late 20s, he was known as a drifter who survived by scavenging, stealing, and sometimes working odd jobs for food and shelter. Lucas had no known connection to Daniel Brooks. They did not attend the same schools, had no shared acquaintances, and lived very different lives. Daniel was a dedicated family man, loved by his community, while Lucas was a loner, drifting through towns and camps. However, the key to understanding what had happened might lie in the forest itself. A breakthrough came when investigators spoke with a man named Brett, who had worked alongside Lucas during a summer trail restoration program in 2013, a year after Daniel disappeared. Brett described Lucas as restless, always roaming off the beaten path, exploring the deepest parts of the forest. He recalled Lucas mentioning that he liked living free in the wild, often bragging about surviving by finding forgotten things in the woods that others overlooked. Lucas spoke of an abandoned truck he had found, but never said whose it was. Brett found it strange, but didn't report it at the time. This information suggested that Lucas had likely stumbled upon Daniel's truck sometime after 2012. The forest was dense and confusing, and a vehicle hidden by brush and debris could easily remain unnoticed for years. But it also raised a chilling question. Was Lucas the last person to see Daniel alive? To answer that, the police examined the contents of the truck more thoroughly. The locked toolbox in the bed contained some of Daniel's personal items, including a hunting knife stained with old blood and a piece of torn flannel shirt. Forensic tests confirmed the blood belonged to Daniel. The discovery was a shock. Why would Daniel's blood be found in his own truck, but his body missing? Experts theorized that Daniel might have been injured and managed to reach the truck for shelter or help. Perhaps Lucas encountered him during this vulnerable moment. If that was the case, what happened next? Did Lucas try to help, or did something more sinister occur? The torn shirt raised suspicion. It suggested a struggle or an accident. Maybe Daniel was attacked or had fallen during his hunt. The blood was old, matching the timeline of Daniel's disappearance, but there was no indication of a fatal wound on the truck or on Lucas's remains. The lack of defensive wounds on Lucas's bones suggested he had not been physically attacked, but the question of what happened to Daniel remained unanswered. Police also began interviewing locals who had spent time in the forest near the discovery site. Several reported seeing a man matching Lucas's description wandering alone in the woods between 2013 and 2015. Some said he seemed paranoid, as if he was avoiding people or hiding something. Others noticed he rarely spoke, kept to himself, and often disappeared for days at a time. These accounts painted a picture of a man who had possibly found Daniel's truck and tried to make it his home. But why had he stayed so long? And why hadn't he sought help? One theory was that Lucas was afraid of being caught for something else and chose isolation over safety. Another was that he was injured or sick, trapped in the forest with limited resources. Investigators could only speculate, but one thing was clear. The two men's fates had become intertwined. Daniel's disappearance wasn't just an accident. It was connected to something that happened between him and Lucas. The forest had witnessed a final encounter, but it had kept its secrets hidden for years. The police renewed their search efforts in the forest, focusing on areas near the truck and the trail restoration sites. They hoped to find Daniel's remains, or more evidence to explain what had happened. Volunteers, search dogs, and forensic teams spent weeks combing through dense brush, rocky outcrops, and deep ravines. Despite the thorough search, no trace of Daniel was found. The absence of Daniel's body deepened the mystery. It seemed as if the forest had swallowed him whole. But if Daniel's remains were not in the immediate area, where else could they be? Had he escaped the forest only to vanish elsewhere, or had someone moved him? In the midst of the search, new leads surfaced from surprising places. A hiker found an old, weathered backpack on a rarely traveled path, and inside were pages from a journal that appeared to be Daniel's handwriting. The entries were fragmented but spoke of feeling watched, encountering a man in the woods, and fearing for his life. One passage ended abruptly. "If I don't make it out, it won't be because of the forest." This chilling discovery confirmed suspicions that Daniel had been in danger long before his disappearance. The journal hinted at a confrontation, someone stalking him in the woods. Was Lucas that man? Or was there someone else involved? The case became a puzzle with missing pieces, but the timeline was now clearer. Daniel had gone missing in 2012. Lucas had entered the forest sometime after, found the truck and its contents, and died there years later. The journal suggested Daniel feared a threat, possibly Lucas, yet without Daniel's body or witnesses, the full truth remained elusive. As the investigation continued, authorities kept Daniel's family informed. The journal gave them a small glimmer of hope, proof that Daniel had fought to survive, and that the forest's silence was not the end of his story. But it also deepened the pain as the unanswered questions multiplied. The tangled timeline, the hidden blood, and the mysterious journal all pointed to one fact. Daniel Brooks's disappearance was no simple accident. It was part of a dark story, woven into the woods, a final chapter waiting to be uncovered. The discovery of Daniel's journal sparked a renewed sense of urgency within the investigation. For years, the mystery had seemed unsolvable, but these new fragments of his thoughts hinted at a story deeper and darker than anyone had imagined. The entries were weathered, pages torn and stained by time and exposure to the elements, yet the handwriting remained legible, trembling with fear and desperation. Daniel wrote about the first days of his trip, describing the forest's beauty and solitude. But as the pages went on, his tone shifted. He mentioned a feeling of being watched, shadows moving just beyond sight, and a man who seemed to appear whenever Daniel tried to find peace. The name Lucas was never written outright, but Daniel's descriptions matched what investigators knew about the drifter who had died in the truck. He wrote about encounters with a stranger who lurked nearby, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking in low, threatening tones. Daniel was terrified, unsure if the man was following him intentionally or if fate had trapped them both in the wilderness. The final pages ended abruptly, with a single sentence scrawled in a shaky hand. "If I don't make it out, it won't be because of the forest." Those words suggested Daniel believed someone was out to harm him, that the danger was human, not natural. With this revelation, detectives shifted their focus from an accident to a possible crime. They began to re-examine evidence from both Daniel's disappearance and Lucas's death with fresh eyes. Lucas's skeleton was tested for toxins and drugs, revealing traces of methamphetamine in his system. The level wasn't fatal, but explained some of his erratic behavior and possible paranoia during his last months. It also added another layer to the story. Had drugs contributed to a violent or tragic confrontation? One disturbing theory emerged. Lucas, already unstable and under the influence, might have confronted Daniel in the forest, possibly over the truck or other supplies. The encounter could have escalated, forcing Daniel to flee or fight back. Perhaps Daniel was injured and left the truck to seek help, but something prevented him from ever returning. Lucas, meanwhile, may have taken over the vehicle, trying to survive until his own death years later. Yet no evidence of a violent struggle or definitive crime scene was ever found. The forest seemed to keep its secrets well. Detectives also reviewed missing persons reports from nearby counties, hoping Daniel might have been seen after leaving. The forest. There were no confirmed sightings, but an anonymous tip came from a man who had camped near a remote creek in 2013. He recalled seeing a figure matching Daniel's description, carrying a heavy pack and moving cautiously. The camper thought the man looked tired but determined, disappearing into the thick woods without a trace. This suggested Daniel might have escaped the immediate area of his disappearance, but remained trapped or lost somewhere unknown. Meanwhile, forensic teams returned to the truck site multiple times, searching for additional clues. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan for hidden objects or disturbed soil, but found nothing conclusive. The lack of Daniel's remains or belongings suggested he might have been moved, intentionally, or by natural causes such as animal activity or flooding. The case grew more complex when DNA analysis of some unknown fibers found in the truck's cab revealed traces that did not match either Daniel or Lucas. The fibers belonged to an unidentified third party, opening the possibility that someone else had been involved. But who? And where was that person now? Police reached out to Daniel's family and friends to gather more background information. They learned that Daniel had recently received a threatening letter from an unknown sender before his hunting trip. The letter was vague, but implied someone was unhappy with him. The motive remained unclear. Was it connected to the disappearance? Could someone from Daniel's past have followed him into the forest? As weeks passed, the investigation turned into a race against time. Seasonal weather would soon make the forest inaccessible again, burying evidence under snow and ice. Search. Teams doubled their efforts, combing through every inch of terrain and re-examining old notes and photos. They set up motion cameras and sensors to capture any unusual movement around the discovery site. Locals grew restless, the forest's eerie reputation deepening. Rumors spread of strange lights, unexplained noises, and shadowy figures seen near the burned area where the truck was found. Some believed the forest was cursed, that Daniel's disappearance and Lucas's death were connected to something supernatural. Authorities dismissed such claims, but acknowledged the power of fear in the community. Daniel's children, now teenagers, were desperate for answers. Their mother struggled to protect them from the media frenzy, while holding on to hope that the truth would emerge. Every new clue was a bittersweet reminder of their father's absence and the unknown fate that haunted their family. Despite the advances, one critical piece remained missing: Daniel Brooks himself. The forest had yielded its secret of the truck and a man's remains, but Daniel's fate was still shrouded in mystery. Had he fallen victim to a stranger? Had he survived for a time, only to vanish without a trace? Or was there something darker at play, something the forest had concealed all along? Investigators knew that solving this case required patience, perseverance, and perhaps a final, unexpected discovery. Until then, the story of Daniel Brooks, the hunter who vanished, and the man found years later in his truck, would remain one of the most baffling and haunting mysteries in Idaho's history. Years had passed since Daniel Brooks vanished without a trace on that hunting trip, and even longer since Lucas Harlan's skeletal remains were found inside Daniel's abandoned truck. But the mystery still clung stubbornly to the forest, refusing to loosen its grip. Authorities, investigators, and Daniel's family all yearned for closure. The story, tangled and complex, needed a final unraveling. After the discovery of the ETI journal and the mounting evidence pointing to a possible confrontation between Daniel and Lucas, the case had evolved from a simple missing person to a complicated cold case filled with gaps and shadows. Investigators combed through every lead, following rumors, anonymous tips, and new forensic technologies that might shed light on the decades-old mystery. One of the most promising breakthroughs came when the forensic team found traces of a second, unknown DNA profile in the truck's cab, small faint samples that didn't match Daniel or Lucas. This suggested that a third person had been involved at some point. Authorities widened the search for any connections, interviewing people in nearby towns, checking for reports of strange visitors, and looking into Daniel's life outside the forest. A name emerged from a tip given by a local hunter. Someone named Mike Thompson, a handyman with a murky past who had worked odd jobs near the forest's edge around the time Daniel disappeared. Mike had a reputation for getting into trouble but was never seriously convicted. He was known to keep to himself, sometimes seen with a gun, and sometimes disappearing for days. Police began investigating Mike's background carefully. His alibi for the day Daniel vanished was weak. He claimed to have been fixing a fence several miles away, but no witnesses could confirm it. In the weeks that followed, Mike was brought in for questioning. Though he denied any involvement in Daniel's disappearance, inconsistencies in his story raised suspicion. Investigators found that he had been in possession of Daniel's hunting knife, a detail previously unknown to the public. The knife had been missing from the truck, and its discovery in Mike's possession was a critical piece of evidence. This suggested a violent encounter between Mike and Daniel might have occurred. Further forensic examination revealed traces of Daniel's blood on Mike's clothing, though Mike claimed it was from a hunting accident unrelated to the disappearance. The police were cautious, but began to consider a new theory, that Mike Thompson had confronted Daniel in the forest, possibly leading to Daniel's injury or death. The motive remained unclear. Was it a robbery gone wrong, a personal grudge, or something darker, perhaps related to a secret Daniel had uncovered during his trip? Meanwhile, the search for Daniel's remains intensified. With Mike's connection established, investigators believed the body might be hidden somewhere remote, buried or lost in the wilderness. Using GPS data, satellite imagery, and help from volunteers familiar with the terrain, search parties targeted several isolated areas where Mike was known to work and hike. One chilly morning, a volunteer dog handler and her search dog found a partially buried, weathered backpack near a ravine deep in the forest. Inside, investigators discovered personal items belonging to Daniel: a torn flannel shirt matching the bloodstains found in the truck, a hunting license, and a family photo. These items suggested Daniel had been alive and moving through the forest for some time after his disappearance. Following this find, the search parties expanded their efforts, carefully combing the ravine and nearby caves. After days of meticulous work, a grim discovery was made: skeletal remains, hidden under a thick layer of leaves and dirt. The forensic team confirmed the bones belonged to Daniel Brooks. The news sent shockwaves through the community and Daniel's family. After years of pain and uncertainty, they finally had some answers. The cause of death was still unclear, but experts believed it was likely a combination of injuries sustained in an altercation and exposure to the harsh elements of the forest. The investigation into Mike Thompson deepened. Evidence suggested that he had lured Daniel into a confrontation, perhaps over Daniel's discovery of something Mike wanted to keep secret. Neighbors recalled overhearing arguments and seeing Mike acting strangely in the weeks after Daniel's disappearance. Police found that Mike had a history of threatening behavior and had recently been evicted from a property near the forest. Confronted with mounting evidence, Mike eventually confessed to a struggle with Daniel in the woods, though he denied causing Daniel's death intentionally. He claimed the fight was accidental, that Daniel fell and was injured, and that Mike panicked, fleeing the scene and leaving Daniel behind. His confession gave some closure but left many questions unanswered. Why? Hadn't he called for help? Why had Lucas Harlan ended up in the truck years later? What role had the drifter played in the tragic chain of events? The link to Lucas became clearer after investigators concluded that Lucas had discovered the truck and possibly Daniel's body after the altercation. Living as a drifter, Lucas had likely used the abandoned truck as shelter, surviving as best he could until his own death. He may have stumbled across the aftermath, unable to leave the remote location or find help. In the end, the forest held two stories, one of a man who vanished, another of a man who perished trying to survive. Both were victims of a brutal wilderness and human desperation. Daniel's family finally held a memorial in the forest, a quiet place where they said their goodbyes. The mystery that had haunted them for years had come to a painful but necessary close. The case of Daniel Brooks became a cautionary tale of isolation, fear, and the dangers lurking in the wild, but also a testament to the relentless search for truth, even when nature itself seemed determined to keep its secrets buried forever.